Europe in the early 1900s was a powder keg. Countries were like rivals in a schoolyard, forming gangs and looking tough. These gangs were alliances promising to protect each other if one got into a fight. On one side, you had the Central Powers, mainly Germany and Austria-Hungary. On the other, the Allies, France, Britain and Russia, were the big players. Everyone was building up their armies and weapons, flexing their muscles. Nationalism was on the rise, with each nation thinking they were the best and wanting more power. Throw in colonial competition for land and resources overseas, and you had a recipe for disaster. It was a tense time, with everyone suspicious of each other, just waiting for something to set it all off. Imagine a room full of people whispering secrets, holding grudges and making threats they don't realize they'll have to keep. That was Europe in the years leading up to 1914. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand provided the match. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting Sarajevo in June 1914. It was supposed to be a routine visit, but it turned deadly. A Serbian nationalist group called the Black Hand wanted to break free from Austria-Hungary's rule. They saw Ferdinand as a symbol of oppression. On June 28th, Gavrilo Princip, a young Black Hand member, saw his chance. Ferdinand's motorcade was rerouted, passing right by where he was standing. Princip pulled out his pistol and fired, killing both the Archduke and his wife Sophie. This assassination wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Austria-Hungary, outraged, blamed Serbia and issued an ultimatum with impossible demands. Serbia, backed by Russia, tried to negotiate but couldn't appease Austria-Hungary. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The alliance system kicked in, and within days all of Europe was at war. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, saw the writing on the wall. They knew that a war with Serbia would inevitably drag in Russia and France. So they decided to strike first. Germany's plan, the Schlieffen Plan, was to knock France out of the war quickly by invading through neutral Belgium. They would then turn their attention to Russia, which they believed would be slow to mobilize. The invasion of Belgium brought Britain into the war. Britain had promised to protect Belgium's neutrality, and they declared war on Germany on August 4, 1914. The world watched in disbelief as the great powers of Europe marched into a war that many thought would be over by Christmas. It wouldn't be a quick war. Instead, it became a brutal, grinding conflict that would last for more than 4 years and claim the lives of millions. The early days of the war were marked by mobile warfare, with armies clashing in open fields. But as the war progressed, the Western Front in particular settled into a deadly stalemate of trench warfare. The Western Front stretched for hundreds of miles across France, from the North Sea to Switzerland. It became a nightmarish landscape of trenches, barbed wire and mud. Soldiers on both sides lived in these trenches for months at a time, enduring constant shelling, sniper fire, and the ever-present threat of attack. Life in the trenches was horrific. Soldiers faced disease, rats, lice, and the constant stench of death. Attacks were often futile, resulting in massive casualties for little gain. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 is a prime example of the horrors of trench warfare. The battle lasted for months with over 1 million casualties on both sides. Despite the massive loss of life, the front lines barely moved. The Battle of the Somme and many others like it came to symbolize the futility and brutality of the First World War. Section 5, Empires crumble the Eastern Front and beyond. While the Western Front was locked in a stalemate, the Eastern Front was more fluid, with vast distances and fewer trenches. Here, Germany and Austria-Hungary faced off against Russia. The Russian army was massive, but poorly equipped and led. They suffered heavy losses, but tied down German troops, preventing them from being used in the West. The war wasn't confined to Europe. The Ottoman Empire, allied with the Central Powers, fought in the Middle East, threatening British control of the Suez Canal. Japan, allied with Britain, seized German colonies in China and the Pacific. The war became a truly global conflict, with fighting taking place in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The empires of Europe were crumbling, and the world would never be the same. Section 6, New Technologies, Old Tactics, the Horrors of Modern Warfare. World War I saw the introduction of new technologies that would change the face of warfare forever. Machine guns, tanks, airplanes, and poison gas were all used for the first time on a large scale. These weapons increased the war's deadliness and contributed to the massive casualties. The machine gun, for example, could mow down attacking soldiers by the hundreds, making offensive maneuvers incredibly costly. Tanks, while still in their infancy, offered a potential solution to the stalemate of trench warfare, but were initially unreliable and used in small numbers. Airplanes, initially used for reconnaissance, soon became weapons of war, with dogfights and bombing raids becoming common. However, military tactics lagged behind the advancements in technology. Generals, still accustomed to 19th century warfare, often launched massive frontal assaults against entrenched positions, resulting in horrific casualties. The disconnect between new weapons and old strategies contributed significantly to the war's brutality. Section 7. A world at war, global impact and escalation. As the war dragged on, its effects were felt far beyond the battlefields. Entire economies were geared towards war production. Governments imposed strict rationing, and civilians faced shortages of food and other essential goods. Propaganda became a powerful tool used by all sides to demonize the enemy and maintain morale. The war also led to significant social and political changes. Women, for example, took on new roles in the workforce while men were away fighting. The war's impact on the United States would prove decisive. Initially neutral, the US was drawn into the conflict in 1917, after German submarines sank American merchant ships. The entry of the US, with its vast industrial might and fresh troops, tipped the balance in favor of the Allies. Section 8. Armistice. The guns fall silent, but at what cost? By 1918, Germany and its allies were exhausted. The German people were starving, and the army was on the verge of collapse. Faced with overwhelming odds, Germany signed an armistice with the Allies on November 11, 1918. The guns fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The world rejoiced at the end of the fighting, but the cost of victory was staggering. Over 16 million people, both soldiers and civilians, had died in the conflict. Millions more were wounded, physically and mentally scarred by the horrors they had witnessed. The war had reshaped the map of Europe. Empires had crumbled and new nations were born, but the peace that followed would be short-lived. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed harsh punishments on Germany, sowing the seeds for future conflict. Section 9. Scars of War. A world forever changed. World War I was, at the time, called the war to end all wars. Tragically, it did no such thing. However, it did fundamentally change the world, leaving enduring scars on the political, social, and technological landscape. The war's end ushered in an era of uncertainty and instability. The old order had been swept away, but what would replace it was unclear. The Russian Revolution of 1917, sparked in part by the war's hardships, led to the rise of the Soviet Union and the spread of communism. The Treaty of Versailles, while intended to ensure peace, created resentment and instability in Germany, paving the way for the rise of Adolf Hitler and the outbreak of World War II just 2 decades later. The horrors of the First World War served as a stark warning about the devastating consequences of unchecked nationalism, militarism, and the failure of diplomacy.